Okay, so welcome to the review session on India and China. We're going to be looking at these civilizations as river valley civilizations and also at the empires that develop in these two areas of the world. So your standards that you need to know that we're looking at standard 3 and also standard 4. On the packet that you picked up at the door when you walked in, at the very top there's a map, and some of what you're asked to label are these rivers and some of the important cities, as well as the regions where these civilizations develop. So when we're talking about the Indus Valley, you're looking at this area that's colored in here along the Indus River, as you might expect. And then when we're talking about early China, we're looking at civilization developing in the Huanghe and the Changjiang River valleys in China. So like all of our other civilizations we've talked about, India and China have these 5 features of civilization we talked about at the beginning of the year: advanced cities, specialized workers, complex institutions, record keeping, and advanced technology. So from their very beginnings, to count as civilizations, they have to have these things. So here's the stuff that we got to make sure that we cover, that we understand the impact of the Aryans, the impact of physical geography, the impact of the caste system, the Maurya and the Gupta. Again, Hinduism and Buddhism are going to be in the other review session. So if you're interested in reviewing religions, make sure that you sign up for that one. So for India's geography, India is sort of unique in the civilizations we've talked about so far this year because it is on a subcontinent, which means that it's part of Asia, but it's isolated from the rest of the continent by river systems and by mountains, right? So we've got the Indus and the Ganges. Obviously, the Indus is where the Indus Valley civilization develops, but also we've got the Hindu Kush Mountains, the mountain range through which the Aryans arrive, and also the Himalayas. So these are going to impact not just where we settle, but also the climate, right? India deals with monsoon winds. These are seasonal winds. They're very, very wet in the summer and they're very, very dry in the winter. And part of that is impacted by the physical geography of the place. So the fact that it's kind of like a giant peninsula, the fact that it's got these mountains in the north, all of that's going to impact our weather patterns and ultimately the way civilization develops. So we see settlements in the Indus Valley. Early on, we have agricultural settlements, so Neolithic period, right? We're farming. We've got villages established by 3200 BCE. We know that these early settlements have a written language, though it is undeciphered. We know that these early settlements have planned cities. We know this because they're on a grid, right? You don't just settle on a grid arbitrarily. This is something that reflects planning, which means that we've got some kind of government, and it also means we've got some kind of job specialization. We also know we've got job specialization and planning and some kind of government because in both Harappa and in Mohenjo-Daro, our 2 major cities of the Indus Valley, we've got indoor plumbing, right, which we don't have in other civilizations for a really long time. So this is something that's huge and is something that has to be organized on a larger level, not just on an individual level. We have an economy based on agriculture, just like, again, in a lot of our early river valley civilizations. But if you look at the kinds of things that Indus Valley is trading, we're trading things, in addition to essentials, we're trading things that are luxury items, right? Like pearls and ivory. We know that the Indus Valley civilization, we know these people were trading with Mesopotamia, and we have evidence of that because of seals, right? Little stamps, basically, that were found in Mesopotamia that were obviously of Indian origin. The religious beliefs that develop in the Indus Valley are polytheistic, and eventually these blend with Aryan beliefs to become Hinduism, which is monotheistic. So the Indus Valley civilization itself, not all of India, but the Indus Valley civilization ends around 1750. There's a variety of explanations, most of them dealing with the geography. However, it is not an invasion, as your textbook would like you to believe. Your textbook says Aryan invasion. If it is an invasion, it's the slowest invasion in the history of time because the Aryans don't arrive until about 1500. With them, they bring the Vedas, which become the primary text of Hinduism, and they also bring the caste system. The Aryans are Indo-Europeans. We've talked about other Indo-Europeans throughout the year. So Aryans, the Mycenaeans are also Indo-Europeans. Slavs are Indo-Europeans. So lots of groups covered throughout the year are of this origin. So when the Aryans show up, they come through the Khyber Pass, like I said, and they end up positioning themselves as sort of dominant in the region. We have the development of Rajas, local warlords essentially, who seize power, but we don't have a lot of archaeological records of their civilization. What we do have are the Vedas. So the Vedas become one of the primary texts, like I said, of Hinduism, and they tell about this arrival of the Aryans in India. They are originally transmitted just through memorization and retelling. And this period of time, because of the significance of the Vedas and the development of the Vedas, is sometimes referred to as the Vedic Age. So in addition to the Vedas, the Aryans also end up contributing the caste system. The caste system, again, is something that comes up in terms of Hinduism, but isn't necessary for Hinduism. The caste system is a way of organizing society initially based on occupation, right? So it was that, oh, you do this job, so you go in this caste. And what it eventually becomes is, oh, you are in this caste, so that means you can only do these jobs. So that wasn't originally why it was developed, but it did allow the Aryans to sort of cement their control over the region when they arrived, because they're bringing in this very rigid structure. We know that, again, they're bringing in religious beliefs, and again, that's in that other review session. So there are good things that come of the Aryan arrival in the Indus Valley. So our caste system, like I said, it's not something that originally was intended to be inherently discriminatory, but it becomes that way. It has all of this other baggage as an institution because it's been around for, thousands of years. With the caste system, as it relates to religion, it ties into this whole idea of reincarnation that's a central belief of Hinduism. So the idea is, this is your caste, and so that means you can do these certain jobs. It also had to do with your spiritual fitness, as it were. The likelihood that in your next life you would be reincarnated to somewhere higher up in this pyramid, right? So that when we're looking, we're being born in as Shudras, and then we eventually, if we're good at that, we're being reborn into these upper levels and eventually reaching moksha and being freed from this cycle of reincarnation. And so this is essential for creating stability in society. So the first empire we see develop in India is the Maurya Empire. It begins in 321 BCE. So this is around the time that Alexander the Great is kicked the bucket, and we start to see a lot of civilization developing in the Mediterranean world, like with Rome. The Republic had already been established almost 200 years prior to this. So that's sort of our global context. The Mauryan Empire was begun by Chandragupta Maurya. He was from the north. He was able to unify large swaths of territory, and his empire was one of the largest empires that India experiences until the modern era. One of the most significant leaders from the Maurya Empire is a guy named Ashoka. Ashoka was an incredibly oppressive and violent leader early on, but he has this sort of spiritual awakening after a particularly bloody battle, the battle at Kalinga, after which he turns to Buddhism, and this really shapes his public policy. It shapes the way he governs. He goes around erecting these rock edicts that have these official proclamations telling his people, that you're my children and this is how I'm going to treat you, and it's going to be fair and kind. And he does all of these wonderful things, but unfortunately he doesn't really set the Mauryan Empire up for long-term success. So after his death, we don't really have a clear line of succession, and eventually the empire comes apart. But he does do a huge service for Buddhism, because while Buddhism doesn't really take off much in India, most of the beliefs get sort of absorbed into Hindu communities, it does spread eastward. And a lot of that is facilitated by Ashoka, that he's sending missionaries to China, to Sri Lanka, that he's encouraging this religion to spread. So that's a good thing he does. So that empire ends. We have this period of sort of small kingdoms battling it out for power in regions of the Indian subcontinent. Our next major empire that's going to develop, though it is smaller than the Maurya Empire, is the Gupta Empire. So this is Chandragupta the First. So Chandra first name, Gupta last name, as opposed to Chandragupta Maurya in the other one. No relation between the two guys, other than they're Indian. So Chandragupta the First founds this Gupta Empire, and this is really the golden age of India. We've talked about golden ages in Greece and in Rome and in China, right? This is the golden age of India. We have a lot of trade, we have a lot of economic growth, and a lot of this is made possible by the stability that exists in Indian society as a result of a focus on family and the importance of religion as well. During this period, we have the construction of hospitals, of schools. During this period, we have the creation of a calendar, a solar calendar, the establishment of a 7-day week, of the calculation of pi, vaccination for smallpox, which is kind of a big deal, right? To be able to not get smallpox is sort of huge. They're performing surgery and setting bones, even doing bits of plastic surgery, so facial reconstructions, things like that. So there are a lot of scientific and cultural achievements that take place during the Gupta, which is why we consider it a golden age. The Gupta, and because we have a lot of internal fighting, right? So we've got these fractures that had existed prior to the development of the Gupta, and it's hard to erase those effectively. So we don't have one empire come into power to control as much of India for the next 1,000 years. So looking at China now, moving eastward, we're going to take a look at the natural barriers. We're going to look at the early dynasties, again, mention Buddhism, look at major achievements, things like the construction of the Great Wall, and also the philosophies that develop and the role that they end up playing in trade networks. So, like India, China is very much impacted by its geography and very isolated by its geography. We've got these mountains, right? The Gobi Desert, we have jungle in the south. And so because they're sort of ringed by these very hostile environments, this leads to this mentality in China that they are what's called the Middle Kingdom, that they are the center of civilization, and that basically everyone else around them is a barbarian. And this comes to inform a lot of their dealings with other people. So even when we're trading and benefiting from things like the Silk Road, there's still this apprehension, like, you don't want to get too close because China is the root of civilization and it is the purest form of civilization. We don't necessarily want to go mixing too much with other groups. Early civilization in China develops along the Huanghe River. It's called the Yellow River because it's got this loess, this very fine soil, like silt that settles into the river and gives it this sort of disgusting mustardy shade when the loess settles and is in the water. And so the Huanghe, even though it's important for agriculture, it can flood very violently and end up making it very difficult for agriculture to take root in some parts. So from very early on, the Chinese are having to look to engineering to solve some of their environmental problems, so that we're building dikes and we're building dams to control these natural features so that we can benefit from them as much as possible without having to deal with some of the negative consequences. Most of early Chinese civilization develops in the space between the Huanghe and the Yangtze or the Changjiang River. This is where it's very fertile. This is known as sort of China's heartland, and it's going to involve major engineering works to create more farmable land. Land has to be made farmable in a lot of areas. There we are. All right, so the Shang Dynasty is the first well-documented civilization in China. It's true that there are civilizations that exist in China possibly prior, like the Xia Dynasty, but the Shang Dynasty is really when we first have a family of rulers, right, dynastic rule, that we have a well-organized political system, and also that we have a lot in the historical record to support its existence. So we know that the Shang had absolute rulers, that they had kings. We know that their capital city was the city of Anyang, which is pretty far to the east. And they had a fairly rigid social system, so that we have a king, that we have priests, nobles, and warriors all taking sort of significant roles in society, and that ultimately society is underpinned by peasantry. We don't really have a lot of slavery in India or in China. In the case of India, we have slavery kind of by another name, because we're able to use the untouchable class and the caste system to do a lot of the work that slaves would otherwise do. In China, we do have slavery, but it's not race-based slavery. It's typically based on conquest, or it could be debt slavery, or as a punishment for something else, some law breaking. But it's not, when we have to sort of get our heads out of that, like, oh, slavery in this very American context, because that's not the way it works in the ancient world, and it's not the way it works in China. Not that it's good still, but just to say. All right, so religion during the Shang Dynasty, we know that they are polytheistic. They believe in a mother goddess, Shangdi, and also in the idea of two forces that need to be in balance in the universe. So that yin and yang need to be, they're not good versus evil in this eternal struggle, but that it is light and dark, and that those are natural counterparts, that you have to have both. You have to have men and women, and warm and cool, and that this idea of balance and harmony is important, because it's like, if these things are out of balance, then that's what's causing problems in society. So it's important that we have balance. The Shang also began the practice of veneration of ancestors. This would be a practice where you would make offerings and pray to deceased relatives in the hopes that they would intervene sort of on your behalf with the gods, because the gods are not particularly interested in you as an individual human, but maybe our ancestors can sort of help us out. We know a bit about Shang religion and about their writing because of oracle bones. Oracle bones are animal bones. So an oracle is something that tells the future, whether it's the oracle at Delphi or we're looking at these oracle bones. But basically they are going to be large pieces of bone, so maybe the chest of a turtle shell, or a hip bone from an animal, but something that you can write on, and messages to the gods would be written in by priests. They would then be heated, and the bone would crack, and they could interpret these cracks and thereby interpret the will of the gods. The benefit that exists for us today with these oracle bones is that they don't break down like paper and like silk. So this is a way that we have early Chinese writing preserved. Now, early Chinese writing was very much restricted to the upper classes because it's such a complicated language. It's not until later with emperors like Qin Shi Huangdi who standardize and simplify Chinese a little bit to make it a little bit more accessible and also standardized throughout the territory instead of having regional variations. So the next dynasty that develops in China after the Shang dynasty is the Zhou dynasty. The Zhou was a rival family that overthrew the Shang. They're able to claim that this was totally legit by saying that they have the mandate of heaven. It's kind of impossible to prove that you have the mandate of heaven, but it's also impossible to prove that you don't, because the way this works is that if I have an army and I'm able to defeat you, then clearly the gods were on my side, because if they were on your side, you would have won and I wouldn't have. So clearly the gods are supporting me and they're not supporting you, because if they were still supporting you, you'd have been victorious and we wouldn't be having this conversation. So all of this is part of the dynastic cycle. So this is how the rise and fall of dynasties is explained throughout Chinese history. During the Zhou dynasty, even though they come to power in this sort of tumultuous power grab, we have a lot of advancements. We've got the development of iron goods, which means that farming can be more productive, which means we can support a larger population. We're using money for the first time. It's not standardized throughout the entire empire. Different regions have different coinage systems. But we are coining money, like metal money. It's typically in the shape of farming implements, and this is something that we're doing all over the place. So that means that we've got economic interaction too, because I don't need money if I'm bartering for things, right? If I'm raising sheep and shearing them for their wool and trading them for rice, like, we don't need money for that transaction. But as economies become more diverse and stronger, money helps all of that move better. We also have the construction of roads and canals, which again is going to facilitate trade, and it's also going to sort of stick things together. During the Zhou dynasty, we have the development of the process of silk making. This becomes an incredibly valuable export for China throughout China's history. It becomes the foundation for, you guessed it, the Silk Road. So the Silk Road, while it doesn't really develop in earnest during the Zhou dynasty, it's not until later during the Han when it really hits its stride. It's during the Zhou that we start to realize that this is a commodity that other people and other civilizations are going to be interested in. So we're going to protect the methods for making this good. All right, so the Zhou dynasty turns to feudalism later during the period because there's so much territory to manage and they're not able to manage it effectively. Now, you've recently been learning about feudalism perhaps in class dealing with the Middle Ages. This is a different kind of feudalism. Feudalism in the Middle Ages in Europe is very much a bottom-up process, right? Like, I'm a peasant and there's Vikings and I don't want to get killed, so I'm going to look to my local lord to protect me. So it's like my idea. Whereas with feudalism in China, we're looking at a top-down system. Like, the king's got all this land, he doesn't know how to manage it effectively, so I might as well divide it up, give portions of it to different lords who I hope will be loyal to me, and then they will manage it in my stead, right? And so if my capital's way far east, it's hard for me to keep an eye on my provinces to the west. So the idea is that these guys would be representatives. As you know, that's not really how this pans out. We end up having this warring states period where these local lords start vying for power. They're more interested in conquering each other than serving their king. This gives rise to what's known as the Hundred Schools period. The Hundred Schools period is when we have philosophies like Confucianism, legalism, and Taoism develop. So these are different schools of philosophy that are supposed to be solutions to China's problem of how should we govern this territory effectively and how should people be treated by the government. The Qin dynasty is able to develop out of these warring clans during the warring states period. So they're one of these states. And they choose, of these three philosophies, the philosophy of legalism. So you'll remember that those three philosophies, Confucianism, legalism, and Taoism, Confucianism is the one that's sort of most balanced. It gets adopted by the Han dynasty. There's a focus on education and also on social structure, right? That there's these relationships and that they matter, and that's what gives society stability. Legalism is the one where basically the government can do whatever they want and they don't have to answer to anybody, emphasizing harsh punishments and rule of law above everything else, loyalty to China above everything else, and the fact that the ruler is exempt from these laws, that he's sort of above and beyond, and anything he says goes. Taoism is sort of the one that sounds nice but doesn't make sense in practice as a philosophy for governing an empire. So this is emphasizing harmony with nature, and the government that governs best is the government that governs least, basically. The idea that government should be limited, that we don't have to worry about controlling people because they're fundamentally good, and you know, you don't really need to fret about it. And that doesn't really, I mean, sounds nice, but it rarely pans out that way. So we're going to see Confucianism and legalism adopted as governing philosophies. And in the Qin dynasty, it's legalism. This is appealing because it's a way to sort of crack down, reorganize, and establish the fact that after this period of chaos, there is one ruler in town, and that is Qin Shi Huangdi. one of the main accomplishments of the Qin dynasty is the construction of the Great Wall. So the Great Wall was a project that brought together some of the walls that had already been constructed in China. It was intended as a fortification to protect from invasions from Mongols and other invading nomadic groups, like the Xiongnu Mongols in particular. So there's the Great Wall, which, while it's this great monument, also is a testament to forced labor and government control. This is the first time we have widely used standardized money that's issued by the government, this one standard Banlan coin. This is when we have standardization of wheel axles and of all kinds of little nitpicky elements of society. This serves two purposes. It demonstrates the fact that the emperor has total control, and it also facilitates economic growth. The issuing of passports occurs during the Qin dynasty. So these are things that control the people and also make it clear who is in charge. So legalism. The problem with the Qin dynasty is it's incredibly repressive. So when Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi dies, one of his sons takes over. He is very soon overthrown. We have these crazy torch-wielding peasant rebellions were happening upon the tomb that Qin Shi Huangdi constructed for himself. These terracotta warriors, things get smashed. And so what we need then are leaders who are going to be more responsive to the people, at least initially. We're certainly not talking democracy or anything, but we're going to look for leaders who are men of the people and who can repeal some of these very harsh things that were brought into place by the Qin dynasty. And we're going to see that in the beginning of the Han dynasty. So the Han dynasty begins with Liu Bang. Liu Bang is a peasant. He was involved in these peasant uprisings toward the end of the Qin dynasty, and his main focus is sort of stripping away the stuff that was not necessary about the Qin dynasty, using Confucianism to guide his ruling philosophy, and bringing China into sort of a golden age. And that's what he does. The Han dynasty is really the height of classical China. This is when Buddhism really gets adopted widely in China. This is when China undergoes a lot of territorial expansion. So this is definitely going to be a prosperous period for China. The Han dynasty is successful because we've got a very highly structured society, right? So we've got these Confucian relationships that we can be reliant on. The government relies also on the use of scholar officials. So Confucian ideals were part of the everyday functioning of the government, to the point where people would take civil service exams, testing their ability to function as a government servant, to serve the people, to be well educated. So you take this exam, and that's how you would get a job in the government, and that's how you would help the government function and the empire function, which works a lot better, right, to have people who are qualified for jobs do those jobs rather than just people who were born into aristocratic families, which is the way we had been doing it before. Because the Han is so focused on territorial expansion, we need to have better agricultural practices, and we need to have a strong military, right? So these agricultural practices need to support this growing military. If I'm going to have a bunch of troops going out conquering stuff, I need to be able to support them. That means also that all those guys in the army are not farming. So that means that our farmers are kind of having to work double time and pay taxes. There's this incredible burden on the peasantry that occurs during the Han dynasty because we're supporting all of this expansion and growth. We see also an effort to standardize China's culture during the Han dynasty, an attempt to sort of bring everybody under one big umbrella and have this common history and this common narrative. So the Han Dynasty starts to come unraveled in the early 1st century. We start to have peasant rebellions, right? This is part of that dynastic cycle. Things are going well, then things are doing less well, and things must be out of balance. Wang Mang, who's a Confucian scholar who was a member of the royal court, decided to take advantage of this instability and lead a peasant rebellion. He'd promised them all these reforms, and it was going to be so great, but then he didn't do it. So he's overthrown, and the original family is restored to power. But as you might imagine, this undermines the authority of the Han, and they're not nearly as assertive in their rule as they had been prior to this. This basically brings us to the end of the presentation of the review session. Hopefully you got something out of it. Hopefully it was helpful to hear it. You can always come back and review this and go back through this information because it is up here on Blackboard. Make sure you take your review quizzes and do those SOL quizzes and tests for class.